I will be speaking on centralization and decentralization, objectives, define centralization and decentralization, establish their utility for bringing effectiveness in the working of public organization, and analyze the advantages and disadvantages. One of the problems of an organization, including that of a public organization, is the issue of centralization and decentralization. In fact, this is one of the dilemmas facing the government and the administration today. While the compulsions of socio-economic planning, the requirements of national integration and considerations of defense strategy pull towards centralization, the regional and local pressures for autonomy and political considerations of greater participation by the people favor decentralization. We are thus confronted with the contradictory pulls and pressures. The decision to split the LIC Life Insurance Corporation of India into 5 autonomous corporations explains the pulls toward decentralization. On the other hand, the establishment of the SAIL, Steel Authority of India Limited, as it is called, is a holding company for all the public sector steel units, plants, which explains the pulls towards centralization. The Planning Commission symbolizes the trend towards centralization, while the Panchayati Raj epitomizes the trend towards decentralization. The issue of centralization and decentralization revolves around the location and the extent of power of decision making in the organizational setup. Broadly speaking, an organization is said to be centralized if most of the power of decision making is vested in the top levels of the organization or its headquarters, so that the lower level or levels of the organization or its field offices respectively have to refer most of their problems to them for decision making. A decentralized organization is one in which the lower levels or the field offices are empowered to decide most of the matters which come up to them, reserving comparatively a very few bigger and more important problems for the higher ones. No system of administration can be described or designated as fully centralized or fully decentralized. If it is fully centralized, there will be nothing for the lower levels. So, to do except transmit problems, such an organization will fall on its own weight and weight of problems. On the other hand, if it is fully decentralized, there is no need for the headquarters. It will be contradiction in terms. Further, it will result in nothing less than anarchy. Thus, the distinction between centralization and decentralization is not absolute, it is relative. Before proceeding further in the discussion of centralization versus decentralization, it would be quite appropriate to understand the meaning of the terms and their definitions. Essentially, centralization denotes concentration of authority at the top or in the higher levels of the organization. Decentralization, on the other hand, denotes dispersal of authority among the lower levels of the organization or its field offices. According to L. D. White, the process of transfer of administrative authority from a lower to higher level of government is called centralization. The converse, decentralization, and decentralization according to David Lindenthal means 3 things. 1. The greatest number of decisions should be taken in the field. 2. It should facilitate active cooperation by the people, and 3. The coordination of the various agencies working in the field should be done in the field itself. That way, decentralization means divesting powers of authorities situated below which are representative. According to M. A. Mutalib, if centralization is the systematic and consistent authority at central points within the organization. Decentralization applies to the systematic effort to delegate to the lower levels all the authority except that which can only be exercised at central point. Henry Fayol states that everything that goes to increase the importance of the subordinate's role is decentralization. Everything which goes to decrease it is centralization. According to Fessler, whether a public organization leans towards centralization or decentralization depends on a variety of factors, which are namely number 1, importance of the matters or issues on which field officials have decision making authority. Second, the extent of central consultation with the field officials in matters that are formally decided at the headquarters. And thirdly, the extent and frequency with which field officials must refer matters to the headquarters. Fourth, the number and the particular nature of central regulations in order pertaining to decision making in the field. And fifth, the provision for appeals to the headquarters against the decisions of the field. And sixth, the caliber of the field officials. Issues of decentralization. The issue of decentralization versus centralization has the 5 aspects relating to number 1, superior and subordinate officers, head office and component parts of the organization, headquarters and field offices, chief executive and functional departments, and number 5, officials and non-officials. The first 2 are administrative, the third is geographical, and fourth is functional, and the fifth is political. To amplify further, it can be stated that if subordinate officers in an organization are vested with a large measure of decision making authority, it is an administrative aspect of decentralization. Another administrative aspect of decentralization is to vest more decision making authority in the component parts compared to the headquarters. If field office, it becomes a geographical aspect of decentralization. For instance, the trend towards vesting more authority in the zones and divisions of the railway administration is a geographical aspect of decentralization. And functional departments are vested with more authority compared to the chief executive. It is a functional aspect of decentralization. It means leaving the power of decision making in respect of technical or professional matter largely to the concerned units. Similarly, in an organization, if more authority is vested with non-officials compared to officials, it is a political aspect of decentralization. The example is that of the Panchayati Raj setup in various states of India. The converse of it can be described as centralization. Facets of decentralization are: often the word decentralization, devolution, delegation and deconcentration are used interchangeably. However, there is a subtle distinction between these words. Decentralization, devolution and deconcentration imply transfer of authority. However, according to Mutalib, deconcentration is based on administrative action, devolution political and legal, decentralization on political, legal and administrative actions. This is a subtle difference. In decentralization, there is the divesting of authority to subordinates, while in delegation, certain specified functions and powers are delegated to the subordinate with a right to take them back or overrule them at any time. As M. A. Mutalib points out, if decentralization tends to seek justice to the subordinate, delegation does to the superior. For under decentralization, what was due to the subordinate by virtue of the authority of knowledge is restituted, while under delegation the superior seeks to provide himself with a relief. State governments in India clamoring for more powers amounts to seeking devolution. The district collector being vested with authority over development departments in the district is an example of deconcentration. The commissioner of the police delegates power to permit holding public meetings to the assistant commissioner of police of the concerned area. There are certain factors which govern the issue of centralization and decentralization. They are responsibility factors, administrative factors, functional factors and external factors. As heads of public organizations or departments, are vested with the ultimate responsibility for their efficient functioning, they generally tend to concentrate important powers in their own hands or to themselves. Necessarily, the factors of responsibility act as deterrent to decentralization. It is well known that authority and responsibilities go together. There are several administrative factors, for example, the age of the organization, stability of the organization, competence of the field staff, which have a bearing on centralization and decentralization. In an old administrative agency, where administrative precedents are well established and norms of administrative behavior crystallized, it is easier to decentralize than in the other kind of organizations. In newer organizations, a certain amount of centralization is inevitable. Stability of policy naturally facilitates decentralization. Frequent changes in policy, as for instance in the case of land ceiling administration, facilitates centralization. The competence of field staff has vital bearing on decentralization. The more competent field staff, the greater propensity in decentralization. According to some writers, administrative sophistication also facilitates decentralization. In other words, the head of the organization should view the problem intelligently with a constructive approach to securing the cooperation of others in the organization. Regarding functional factors, it can be stated that the extent of decentralization depends on the nature of functions entrusted to the organization. If the function is of national importance, it requires some sort of uniformity. It facilitates a function like agriculture, crop insurance, which requires diversity. It facilitates decentralization. Further, in multifunctional organizations, there is greater scope of decentralization than in unifunctional organizations. Lastly, some external factors like people's participation and safeguarding regional interests facilitates decentralization. After the Industrial Revolution and in the context of enormous advancements in the field of science and technology, centralization in administrative organizations is growing despite professed concern for decentralization. In the first place comes technology, which works in three complementary ways: by conquering distance first, by making execution more mechanized, and by helping to process a mass of information through the computer and cybernetics. Secondly, the history of all imperial conquests followed by nationalist liberation movement showed the centralization of the decision making power in few hands. And thirdly, in the context of competitive world economy and the requirements of developing countries, centralized economic planning has become inevitable. The advantages of centralization are several. Centralized supervision, regulation and control results in economy and efficiency as it reduces the overhead costs. As centralization provides for greater controls, it is felt that administrative abuses would be fewer. Centralization ensures a sort of uniformity and standardization throughout the jurisdiction. It ensures that the work is done in more or less the same manner in an area, in accordance with the general policies and principles that have been laid down. Whenever the importance and urgency of a program is felt, it is usually centralized. In other words, it is placed under the charge of the central government or the highest level of the organization. Under modern conditions, financial considerations facilitate centralization. Smaller jurisdictions are not considered financially viable. That is, they cannot support themselves financially. In the context of national economic planning, centralization is inevitable. In India, it is part of experience that state governments have to act at the behest of the union government, even in the matters relating to minor irrigation, electricity, land reform and so on, when they have constitutional authority over these subjects in the listing arrangement. The consideration of defense strategy and national integration facilitate centralization. Besides, the central government gives grant in aid to the state governments and other public organizations like universities. In order to ensure proper utilization of these grants, a certain amount of central control is also inevitable. This facilitates centralization. Disadvantages of centralization. First, it results in congestion of business at the top. In other words, there is heavy concentration of authority at the higher levels of administration. This results in bottlenecks and consequent delays. Further, the flexibility of approach in making decisions is lacking in centralization. In a centralized system, decisions are taken at a point far distant from the people and the places where they are going to be affected. This tends to make administration wooden in the approach, so to say. In addition, centralization does not facilitate people participation. Even the cooperation of the people would be less forthcoming in a centralized system. Centralization thus is not an unmixed blessing. Several thinkers are of the opinion that over centralization has become the bane of Indian administration. Now, we come to decentralization. First, we will list its advantages. As regards decentralization, several advantages can be cited in its favor. In a decentralized system, administration is closer to the field of operation and nearer to its clientele. Naturally, decisions and programs can be adopted to suit the requirements of the local conditions. That is, there is no scope for congestion of business at the top in this system. It is self-evident. Further, administration can be in touch with the people through people cooperation and participation. In addition to all this, coordination of work in the field can be done in the field itself. Decentralized administration would be more participative in character and people oriented in its outlook. It gives an opportunity to develop resourcefulness and self-respect among subordinate administrators who have to decide themselves to take their own decisions and shoulder their own responsibilities. In other words, if development initiatives and dynamism among the lower level functionaries of an organization to boldly take decisions with a sense of responsibility. According to Charles Worth, decentralization has more important justifications than a mere administrative efficiency. It bears directly upon the development of a sense of personal adequacy in the individual citizen. It has spiritual connotations also. Now, we come to disadvantages. A decentralized system breeds localism and parochialism. Problems are viewed from the immediate local angle. The national perspective usually gets lost. Too much of decentralization may lead to anarchy. If the function is one of national importance, it requires some sort of uniformity. It facilitates a function like agriculture, crop insurance requiring diversity, as I told earlier. It facilitates decentralization. Further, in multifunctional organizations, there is a greater scope of decentralization than in unifunctional organizations. Some external factors like people's participation and safeguarding regional interests facilitates decentralization.